You are listening to WKVT 100.3 FM and 1490 AM. We have preempted our regular programming to bring you a call to action, a public forum that focuses on critical issues facing the greater Brattleboro area. Today's topic is civics. My name is Chris Lenios, and I'm joined by my WKVT colleague Fish to moderate this conversation, along with a panel of guests to talk about some of the challenges in our community around the issue and hopefully shed some light on available resources. We're broadcasting live from the meeting room at Brooks Memorial Library until 1 p.m. Members of the community are welcome to come in and listen as well as participate in the discussion. This program is being recorded by Brattleboro Community Television for later airing on their cable channels and BrattleboroTV.org. We'd also like to acknowledge Brattleboro Savings and Loan and Farnham Insulators as sponsors of our call to action forums, and we'd also like to thank the Works for their refreshments today. Fish?
Yes, so here we are. We're going to be talking about civics today. It's very much a part of being an American, yet it's something we often take for granted. In our very last election here in Brattleboro, only 1,463 voters turned out to the polls. This from a pool of 8,763 registered voters in Brattleboro. 17% overall. Break that down into numbers that sound even smaller. 479 from District 1, 473 voters from District 2, 511 voters from District 3. We are constantly allowing a small percentage of the population to make big decisions for us. We've become complacent and indifferent to our political process and how our government works. We have become one-issue voters who time and time again vote against our own best interests, and we are not tethered to the simple and constitutional fact that we are a government for the people and by the people. That alone gives us the power. We make the decisions. We appoint the representatives that support our beliefs. Yet, here in a town that I consider to be very politically active, we can't even get half the people to show up to the polls. And in this day and age where voting prior to the election has become so incredibly easy, I blame the lack of civic knowledge. Knowing how things work is key. Today we hope to shed some light on what we believe will be a strong panel of guests. And today, that's how we will begin our call to action.
Yeah, and later on in the program, we'll be talking about the civic engagement aspect of things. Vermont Secretary of State Jim Condos will be here, along with Matt Wright, the founder of the Brattleboro chapter of Indivisible. But we are beginning with that education component, like Fish was talking about, with regards to civics and how it is taught within our schools. In 2013, Tufts University Center for Info and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement did a study and found that 60% of young adults who studied voting in high school voted in the 2012 election. 43% of those young adults who did not study voting or civics in high school were only the ones who cast ballots. So there's a definite correlation between studying civics in school and then your civic engagement as you become of age to vote and be part of things. Now, at one point in time, civics was a required class in school. Since then, that seems to have become more of a state-to-state, school-to-school kind of approach to things. And instead, civics has become social studies. We have two people here on the panel to start off this show to talk a little bit about the educational aspect of things. We have Stephan Morse, who just completed his 6-year term on the Vermont State Board of Education, including being the chair. He is also a 4-term member of the House of Representatives, spending 2 terms as House Speaker in the Vermont Legislature, and Koplinka-Loehr, who is a social studies teacher at the Brattleboro Area Middle School. Thank you both for coming in today.
Thanks for having us.
And let's start with you, the teacher, and that what I was just talking about with that civics and social studies, and there is a distinction there between those terms, isn't there?
So what I would say is, if I were to sum it up in just a couple words, that civics really does have to do with government and engagement in voting, knowing what the democratic process is, and social studies is much broader. And what I teach at the middle school, I teach 7th and 8th grade social studies. Actually, I have a student of mine right here in the audience. And we cover everything from human origins and migration throughout the world to history of North America and the United States. So it's much more history, geography, and actually the standards themselves reflect that, a lot about inquiry and research, whereas civics is just a small slice of that, I would say.
So when you're working, and you're working with 7th and 8th graders?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So your expectations of what they should know about government structure and things like that by the time they get to junior high? It sounds to me like you kind of have an expectation that that's something that's done at the elementary school level.
Well, they do have a little bit, students coming in from different elementaries have different backgrounds. That's one of the things that's a little bit challenging is, we sometimes have 4, 5, 6 different elementary schools represented in our classrooms. Usually they have a general idea of like, okay, I can identify that this is the President of the United States, but not necessarily even that there's 3 branches, whereas some could name the 3 branches of government. And by the end of 8th grade, they are expected to know a fair amount about the Constitution, the 3 branches of government, how the government works. Right now we're doing a unit on the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. So I think it's important for students to at least know what their rights and freedoms are. I mean, we had actually Officer Mark Kerrigan came in on Tuesday to talk with students about, if a police officer stops you, here's the things that you can and can't do. Here are the rights that you have. But as far as I'm aware, there's not a high school civics class that's required for graduation. You need to take 3 social studies classes, and then at least ideally embedded in that is some information about civics. But same thing with our curriculum. Right now it's district to district, the state has proposed these different proficiencies for graduation requirements, but each district can decide to either adopt them or adapt them, essentially.
Is this something that happens as conversations within the social studies department in the middle school? Do you ever have interaction with the high school social studies department?
I mean, I would say I have regular contact with the high school social studies teachers, but in terms of formal meetings, it's fairly infrequent that we'll get together as middle and high school social studies departments together, maybe once or twice in the last couple of years. And we did get together to take a look at these Vermont proficiencies and say, okay, here's what we want to focus on in middle school. How do you want to continue on with this in high school, just in terms of the broad arc of proficiencies, which is kind of the direction that the state is moving now. But I would say it's more individual interactions that I have with teachers. So I would have to go and ask a teacher at the high school about how the classes are shifting around. There's no sort of official way of communicating that information to all the social studies departments and teachers in the district.
And when you're talking about those proficiencies, is there a way to evaluate those? Are you looking at evaluations, or that's kind of the crux of the biscuit, isn't it?
So that's a tricky thing. The high school has come up with different rubrics to try to evaluate them, and there are some that are presented by the state to say, okay, here's some ways of assessing whether a student is proficient, exceeding the proficiency, or kind of on their way developing proficiency. So our whole school actually is talking about moving towards a more proficiency-based model rather than just letter grading. And I think we might have a couple years of transition where we do letter grading and proficiencies, but that is a challenge and from teacher to teacher, does this, how many times do you have to show that you're proficient? And what are the ways to assess that? That's a really key issue.
Yeah.
One of the things that's de-emphasized, if you will, the emphasis on civics, I would, this is an opinion, is that there's as you all know, there's a huge movement to set national standards for graduation. And I don't think that necessarily takes in the needs of a state or of a locality. And that's so that over time, and we're going through that process again right now with the proposed ESSA rules for graduation, that it takes away from the local school district the authority to establish some of these important programs, such as civics, that many of us sitting here at the table had while we went to school.
Right. Yeah, I was wondering, Stephen, if you could speak to on the State Board of Education, obviously with local control, obviously such emphasis with local school boards and local schools, what sort of interaction the State Board has on maybe not even necessarily social studies or civics, but just on a curricular level in general.
Well, the philosophy of the State Board of Education has been that to allow as much discretion as possible for local school districts, within certain guidelines. But that gets rather difficult with federal mandates. So that has become less and less possible as time has gone on. And I would guess that civics is one of the areas that suffered as a result of it.
Yeah.
I can recall, and I was having this conversation with Linda Steele back at the station this morning. Linda's a year or two older than I am, and she went through her whole high school learning civics. About halfway through high school for me, which would have been about the 10th or 11th grade, it became social studies. So it sort of changed over while I was in school. And I go back to those Sunday morning cartoons, The School of Rock, and how they would teach you civics. And maybe it's why I'm so passionate about getting out and voting and not understanding how, you can barely pull 500 people out of a district here in Brattleboro to go and vote on important things. I mean, we're voting people in. So the difference, though, and I can remember, I thought social studies was like a really cool class and probably would have taken it, and civics was certainly a duller, drier topic. There's no question about it. How our government runs is a real yawner to a kid. At least it was to me. But you pointed out the statistic about those who actually learned what civics means, and with a correlation to how they vote. I think that's an interesting. That's really something that we need to take a look at. I mean, and how do you feel about it? Do you feel like civics should be, just your own personal opinion, you feel like it should be taught?
Definitely. I mean, I feel like I'm certainly biased as a social studies teacher. I mean, I wouldn't have gone into social studies if I didn't think that civics were important. But I had to take a civics class in high school. We had both social studies and civics. And I mean, I feel like within this capitalist system that we live in, the push is for big money. And we've actually talked about this in our class. A few people with a large amount of wealth end up having a large amount of power, and at least in some ways, the Constitution is set up to try to at least guarantee certain rights for people and guarantee checks and balances for, at least this one group of people can't make all the decisions all the time.
Right.
And I think, it was interesting reading that article that Chris sent out, because it really points out how many millennials are sort of getting complacent. I see that both in my generation and I think a little bit in the students' generation of we haven't seen any, yes, there's major wealth inequality, but it's not like we see human rights abuses happening around us on a daily basis. I guess the people who have power, they probably know what they're doing. I guess I'll sort of sit here and, play on Facebook or something. I feel like it's sort of, what's the term? It's kind of a term about apathy, clicktivism or something about activism.
Yeah,
it's just you just click a button or something.
Right. Well, we were, again, Chris and I, as we were setting up this morning a little bit, and we were talking about just some of the basic knowledges of what our government entails, and Chris had made the point saying, can you even name the three branches of government? And I said, I can. It's Goldman Sachs, Walmart, and Mobile Exxon.
Right.
So those are our three branches of government. But it just, and tragically, even though the joke is there and intended, I don't feel like it's far from the truth. And I think that when people step into the voter's booth, do not understand that we are really just we're not really governed anymore by the people we elect to do it, because essentially if the dollar doesn't yell loud enough, it doesn't happen. But that comes back onto us.
Well, that's actually a good question. I'd like to hear from both Stephen and Ann, and then I know we have a student in the room, and I'd be interested in hearing his opinion on this as well. Has that sort of cynicism that Fish just expressed seeped down even into the level of a middle school student? Do they understand that sort of cynicism? Because I think that does. There's a zeitgeist around, oh, my vote doesn't make a difference. Me getting involved, especially on the national level in a little state like Vermont, it doesn't necessarily feel like you're making a difference, even though you are.
I would say yes and no. I mean, part of the reason that I went into becoming a middle school teacher is because middle school was very formative for me. And I feel like it's this time period when young people are starting to figure out, okay, here's what my parents are telling me, here's what my friends are telling me, what do I actually think about this? And I feel like many of them are very passionate about issues of justice in the world. When we talk about inequality, wealth inequality, and injustice, a lot of students are like, this is wrong. I don't necessarily know that they feel like they have a lot of power to fix it, but the other day I had a student in class saying, well, what if all the students just disobey the dress code at the same time and we did it all at once, So I think they have a bit of a sense of collective action can make a difference. I was actually, as part of the union, the Vermont NEA, I saw Senator Sanders. He had a town hall specifically with the Vermont NEA during our representative assembly. I think that was last Saturday. And he was talking about Citizens United and how important it would be to just completely reverse that decision. But I think I think there has been a general erosion of democracy and of people feeling like they can make a difference with there being so much power from the corporations.
Well, back to Fish's point about the small turnout that you're seeing here in Brattleboro, which is also true statewide. It's a bit confusing because in Vermont, I would argue that the wealth and the finance doesn't have the influence that it does in other larger states or certainly nationally. And then I also point out that government is very accessible in Vermont. We meet annually at town meetings. It's easy to access your representative and your senator. Even easy to represent the governor's office. So it's a little disturbing that the turnout is so low when people are participating. I mean, I can certainly understand it in larger states and on a national level where you say, why bother? That the wealthy have the control. That's not true in Vermont, but yet people are not participating at levels that they used to.
I would agree with you and wholeheartedly, because I think you're right. I think that here in Vermont we do have a unique situation where we have more direct access to our local politicians. But I also feel like this apathy and this disconnect from our civic duties and our responsibilities is systemic the right word? Where I think that it can just wash over if we get too lazy, and to try and re-engage people into the process. And even just the simple act of voting for a select board person is true. Now, more stats on that, and we'll just pick District 3 since they won the voting pool from the last election. The early ballots that were processed were 165 of the 511. That's how many people voted. So, but that just shows you how much less. See, I'm a game day player. So I like to head out on election day, get my sticker, harass who's ever running for office and move on. I mean, that's just, it's part of the game for me. It really is part of what makes being an American great, is going out to the polls, casting your vote, over and over again. And again, not the problem here in Vermont, but we see where these long lines during a presidential election, and this particular presidential election was so charged that, and it became just tethered to nothing, and it really was. It just became if you will, a series of alternative facts after alternative facts. Basically, you can watch it happen and just say it didn't happen, and people would seemingly start to believe it. It was just crazy. So, and I think that's what sort of stimulated this when Chris and I talked about what topic we wanted to cover, getting kind of back to the basics and seeing if we can't re-engage the voter. But what will it take to re-engage the voter?
Yeah, in your opinions, and certainly, Stephen, your historical context on this, having served in the House back in the 70s and 80s. I mean, are we wrong? Are people less engaged now than they were then? We can certainly look at voting numbers and sort of see a downward trend, but there has to be sort of an anecdotal aspect of that too. You certainly probably feel that way.
Well, I don't know. I mean, that depends on the election, depends on the candidates, depends on the area you're talking about. I think over the years, have seen the elections for state representatives, for example, getting much more active, that there are more candidates running, both in the primary and general election. And certainly what's happened in the last 20 years is that the complexion of the legislature has changed. I mean, historically, for almost 200 years, it was a Republican legislature. You asked somebody who was going to win in June, and you could get an answer. But now it's predominantly a Democratic legislature, reflective of the state of Vermont for sure. But I think campaigns are probably more active than they used to be, and more exciting, more interesting. Look at the gubernatorial campaign in the last election. I can't remember how many candidates, but a number of candidates, and a real complexion of philosophy expressed. But back to Fish's point, the percentage of who turned out to vote is still pretty low.
Yeah, and I do truly, personally, I don't know why I take it so personally when we have these super low turnouts on votes. When we are selecting a local government body that will make decisions for us locally.
Or in situations, and I say this a lot on my show, with regards to money, when you're going out for your town meetings and you're voting on budgets, or just yesterday there was a bond vote in Dover on a wastewater treatment plant.
Very interesting.
Less than 100 people decided on $4.7 million worth of money, and the bond failed by a single vote, 36 to 35. I mean, you're talking, and I always say, this is our money that people are playing with here and doing that stuff. You would think that would be enough impetus to get people out and engaged, but you wonder if there is enough of or if there's too much of a disconnect, especially in those early levels. And I don't know, Ann, how you foster that at somebody that young.
Well, I think it really is the people who show up who end up making the difference, whether that's in the union or in local elections or something. And I think that's a tricky thing to foster. I think in my mind, there's sort of two ways that I sense that people look at it. One is sort of, I guess I trust the people that are doing their job, the people who are engaged. I think that happens in the union a lot. And also locally, I think people say, like, great, basically the people who have been elected, I kind of am good with going with them, so I'm not going to really get too involved unless there's something I disagree with. And then nationally, I think we saw, especially with the Trump election, people who felt like they didn't really feel strongly about either candidate. They didn't really feel like, okay, I could get fully behind either one, and felt really, especially in Vermont, very frustrated that Sanders didn't make it to the national election. And I think economics had a lot to do with how that...
All of us agreed with that.
I think that the economics had a lot to do with the way that people voted in this most recent election. I think Trump was able to speak in some way to a group of people that felt like Wall Street has taken over politics, and say, you know what, even though I'm part of the 1%, I don't agree with Wall Street controlling politics. And I'm going to try to give back jobs to working class white folks. And that was heard in a certain, portion of the voting folks.
Speaking for me personally, and we've got to take a break here in a moment. I know that he kept constantly referring back to the coal industry and creating coal jobs, and to me it was just, it's like trying to resuscitate the cassette. I don't understand how people get tethered, but that speaks to your one-issue voter, that person who goes out because they want their guns protected, or they want affordable care, or they want something that is the biggest thing in their life at that moment. That's what they vote on. So whatever candidate says, what they agree with, they could agree with that one thing and disagree on every other point, but they're going to vote for that candidate because of that one issue. So I think that the lack of civics is what brings us to that point.
Yeah, lack of understanding of that. And we will continue this conversation around civics from the Brooks Memorial Library. Chris and Fish on WKVT's A Call to Action, and Koplinka-Loehr from the Brattleboro Middle School, and Stephan Morse, former chair of the Vermont State Board of Education, here on the panel. We have some guests in the audience who are going to speak when we come back after this break on WKVT. Welcome back to A Call to Action. The focus of today's forum is civics. Chris Lenios and Fish here at the Brooks Memorial Library. We are live until 1 p.m. Come on down. We've got coffee from the works, and certainly a lot of panelists here interested in your thoughts about civic engagement and civic education. We've been focusing on the education portion of this for the first hour with Ann Koplinka-Loehr, a social studies teacher at Brattleboro Area Middle School, and Stephan Morse, former chair of the State Board of Education. But there are some people in the room here as well wanting to talk about this, including a student of Ann's from the Brattleboro Area Middle School. His name is Miles Anton. Good morning to you, Miles. Thanks for coming in.
Good morning. Thank you. So when I look at the Democratic and Republican Party at a national scale, I see a party of 70-year-old men, and back to your point, Fish, of corporations. And I just don't find that reflective of the voting demographic of America. So I think that the way that we need to change that is through education and through empowering the youth of our country, like Senator Sanders' campaign for president. The things he was talking about, healthcare, poverty, the wage gap, things like that. Those are the issues that the youth in America care about. So I think that we need to inform people through education and the youth, because that's the only way we're going to change our system.
Let me ask you, Miles.
How old are you, Miles?
I'm 13.
Okay, you can take my headset now. You were my
I know, right? The most eloquent person in the room by far. what engaged you around the issue of civics, around politics and government? What was it a trigger for you that this is an interest for you at such a young age?
Well, honestly, I think it was the 2016 election. It was a crazy election based on like the elections we've had before, and it ended up, like you said, it's about alternative facts, and I don't think people really were able to rally behind one candidate. So I think we need more transparency and people to represent everyone, and that's what really engages me, just like the idea of a future where people's views can really be represented by the government.
So prior to this election cycle, it wasn't really something like in 2012 you weren't paying attention then. I mean, and granted, you were younger by 4 years than you were now, but it was kind of this last campaign cycle that really kind of brought you into it and said, hey, let me check this out.
Yeah, during 2012, I was mainly playing soccer.
Right. You might go back to it by 2020.
Yeah.
Did you feel like heading into this election that you had been grounded in some of the fundamentals of government, of executive branch, legislative branch, judicial branch? Is that something that you feel like you have a good grasp of at this point?
I do feel like I have a good grasp, especially with the Brattleboro education. I think Ms. Kale is my teacher. I think civics is the main focus of that class, but I understand that it's varied throughout the state. Social studies and civics, what's taught. And I think we really need to ask ourselves, like, what's more important, if you can, point out some country on a map, or if you can know your rights as a citizen?
Well said.
Yeah, no, you can't argue with that logic, and I mean that is just base.
I think that's one of the things that's happened historically in this whole area, is perhaps in my generation, more emphasis was on civics and how government worked in Vermont and maybe nationally. And then as the world to all of us broadened and we became more aware of the big world, these programs, educational programs, are constrained by time. I mean, kids are only in school for a certain amount of time every day. So I think as that era arrived, and there was more emphasis on European history, and Far East history, and that was at the expense of what used to be taught for civics. I don't know how to balance that out now, but I think that's historically what happened and why there's less civics in our school system today.
But hearing Miles talk, though, I have to say, for me, I mean, this is a young man who's very engaged in the process, who will probably remain engaged in the process, and that to me gives me hope, because that's really where we have to build, we have to educate, and we have to get people tethered to that belief that, without education, nothing happens. I mean, we can walk around as uneducated as we want, again, just beating the drum on one issue.
Here's a politically that, and this especially applies, I think, to the state of Vermont, it's pretty well known in advance which candidate's going to win often in elections. Mm-hmm. Was there any question that Bernie Sanders was going to be the top presidential candidate in Vermont? No.
Right.
And when we got to the general election, was there any question that Hillary Clinton was going to win the state of Vermont? So, and there are a lot of elections like that. And I think that discourages people to get out and vote.
Yep.
And to take the time to vote.
Although with the gubernatorial election, I think
yes.
it was kind of neck and neck, and people didn't know if it was going to be Scott or Minter up until the last minute. I think it was a bit of a surprise to some folks. So I think nationally, I would definitely agree. But more of these local and state elections, it can sometimes go either way.
It doesn't sound to me, though, like for Miles, were you paying attention to the state elections, the local elections, or was it really just the presidential race that kind of activated you?
I was mainly activated by the presidential race, but I went to a Minter presentation at the school, so I do think we have more power when it comes to state and local elections, especially in the state of Vermont. We're a very small state, 600,000 people. So that is where we can really make a difference, by voicing our opinions, by putting pressure on the people we elect to fight for the things that we want to be fought for.
And I want to ask you, because there's something that your teacher said in the previous segment where you were talking about the dress code and students talking about, should we protest this? And it seems to me that, I wonder, I mean, in terms of how you can make a difference. Some people are looking at it from inside the system, right? Running for an office, being part of the system, or being on that outside part. And we're going to get to a lot of that in the second portion of this when we talk about activism and the role there. But do you feel more like you can make more of a difference, you can enact more change outside of the system as somebody protesting something like a dress code versus going through whatever mechanisms of government exist?
Well, in the First Amendment, we have 5 rights, and one of them is the right to assemble peacefully. So protest is a good way of getting things done, but if you want to work within the system, you can do that, especially within the state of Vermont. So I think we need to work from all directions.
And so you're declaring for your candidacy win. Yeah.
2028 miles.
2028. Terrific.
Anton for president.
Terrific. Well, yeah. Didn't mean to talk over you.
No, that's all right. I mean, it's just really he's given me a lot of hope.
Well, I took the top volunteer, so
yeah.
It was self-selected.
All right. No, it's really good that it's out there, and I think that this speaks to a lot of what we've been talking about is basically educating the youth to get them active, because I don't think that anything in the next 2 or 3 years is going to change enough so that I don't expect to see more than 1,500 people showing up in the next select board election. I hope that's different, but I just don't think it. I just don't think it will be. Yeah. So having guys like Miles out there, really,
it's encouraging.
It is. It's so much so.
Absolutely. We have another guest up at the mic. Thanks for coming in.
Thank you for having me.
Your name?
I'm Wendy Harrison. Moved to Vermont about a year and a half ago. Most of my adult life has been spent in Florida, which has pretty interesting politics.
Yeah.
And just a couple of questions, or I'd like your opinion. In civics education, my life has been spent mostly in local government, which is not as boring as you might initially think it is. Doing a lot of outreach, having citizen open houses where we would invite them into our government, let them know what we did. And local government can really make a big difference in folks' lives, and sometimes they're surprised to find out the extent of that. And I think part of that is because folks haven't been educated on what their local government does. Same with state government. The character of a state is often I would say, I don't know, mostly, but the government of a state is just inherently part of the feel of that state, and it's one of the things that makes Vermont very different from Florida. It's much more than weather. And geography. It's the culture, and that's reflected in the government. And right after the national election, I happened to be with a lot of 20-year-olds in that age range, and there was a lot of despair and talk about moving to Europe, Canada, and I tried to reassure them, to let them know that everything isn't determined by the national government. A lot is determined by the state and by local, like the EPA regulations, for example, those are handled in many states by the state government. So we can protect our water, we can protect our air. Obviously, the finances are something we need to be concerned with, but I think it can lessen that kind of despair if they know the level of control that people have on a local and state level. And so I think it's important that we do educate. I mean, now we need to educate adults as well as kids.
Which is, if you'll excuse me, probably the hardest part of this process.
Right. So, because you got to make it interesting, you have to make it snappy, and our news is now.
And you got to deliver it in a minute, and it has to come up in your Facebook feed.
Right. And you got to compete with all these other things that are pulling at adults' attention.
But it's more than a horse race. It's more important than a commercial. I mean, we just and I think people are shocked into noticing that now.
Yeah.
So this is a learning opportunity. Teaching opportunity.
On your point, Wendy, I have always said that voting in your local elections are more important than voting for Hillary or Trump or even Sanders on a national level.
And you brought that up, right?
Yeah. So I have always believed that and I've said this before, that that a lot of people are one-issue voters, but everybody hates their tax bill.
Right.
Well, if you hate your tax bill, then you have to vote locally, because these are the people who are going to change that. Donald Trump doesn't care what you're paying for. Donald Trump doesn't care. We could just leave it there. But he he is not going to affect our local tax base. Our local elected officials will affect that. And that, when you get down to the crux of it, is what you're paying out of your checking account is everybody's issue.
But let me make another, give another example on the comment that you started this all off by the low turnout that we experience historically. You know, a big public policy issue that's happening statewide, but particularly in this area right now, is Act 46, a new organization for school districts. And it's very controversial in this area because the town of Vernon has some special privileges for school choice. And under the way this law works, I'm trying to shorten the whole process here, is that, you know, that it calls for the demolition of the supervisory union, and all towns need to approve that before that can happen. And the town of Dummerston twice has voted not to let Vernon out of the school district. And both votes. I mean, this is a major issue for who Vermont is going to be in the future. And those two votes in Dummerston, very low turnout.
Yeah, less than 300 people, I believe, for both of those.
And, you know, I'm not arguing the point of whether they should allow Vernon to go or not, but it's startling that people aren't taking this seriously and turning out to vote. I think the vote in Vernon, when they voted in pullout, was pretty substantial.
Right.
So there's a lot of public policy issues that get decided on, even in our state, where people have a voice in the process, and they don't turn out.
Issues versus candidates make a difference too when you actually are deciding on a person running for an office versus an issue like Act 46 or like a wastewater treatment plant. It just seems like if you can't put a face and a voice to an issue, that directly affects the turnout quite a bit as well.
Right. We have somebody else at the microphone. What's your name?
My name is Jessica Turner, and I'm the director of Brattleboro School Without Walls in Brattleboro. And I have a question for the panel about broadening the idea of civics. I was thinking specifically about the educator Maria Montessori, who said you need to teach students to love the world before you can teach them to save it. And I'm wondering how, as educators and as legislators, one actually helps people love where we are right now. That Brattleboro is a special place. It's a unique place. How do you actually get things done in Brattleboro? Why do you love living here? Do you feel connected to the community? Because all those things are the building blocks for then actually wanting to go and vote on $4.7 million of our tax money to say, like, hey, this is what I believe in, or this isn't what I believe in. So I was interested in your opinion on that.
I'm going to let the teacher answer.
I'm still processing the question. I feel like that is kind of the crux of education itself. And I don't think there is a straightforward answer to it. I mean, the best that I've been able to figure out is how can I bring myself to my teaching as much as possible, and be invested in the community. I mean, in the car ride over, we were talking about my involvement with the union, and I realized there's some things I don't talk about a lot with my students because there's sort of this expectation that there's going to be a fourth wall between teachers and students.
Right.
And I think the structure of school sets that up that way. And it's tricky, I think, I've talked with a lot of teachers recently who feel very discouraged because I think there's this coming together of a lot of different challenges going back to what we were talking about with wealth inequality and capitalism. Capitalism is crushing people, and people's lives are hard as a result of it. So students are coming to school with all these needs that need to get met, and the school's expected to meet those needs. So it's almost, I don't really want to invoke Maslow's hierarchy, but it does seem like there's a lot of needs that need to get met before students can even be available to make those relationships within school. And again, also, you have a room of 20 students and maybe one or possibly two adults. It's challenging to have those one-on-one relationships within that structure. But I would agree. I think relationships are key, both with other students, with adults, with the community. And with the push of kind of individualism and the profit motive and all these things that competition that capitalism is telling people, I think all the forces are pulling people away from building relationships. So I think it's actually a revolutionary act to be building those relationships. And I do feel kind of stumped. I feel like my whole job as a teacher is to figure out the answer to that question.
Me too. No, me too.
I don't know. Maybe Miles can speak to whether I do that at all in my classroom. It's a tricky thing to do.
Well, and what is an approach for like the School Without Walls, where it's a homeschool model, essentially, right? What you're doing there. I mean, and how do you evaluate and what do you instill as far as civics, social studies kinds of lessons?
Sure. Well, I was, thinking about that. Obviously, that's why I'm here. I think we actually do those building blocks quite well, and yet we don't actually teach civics at that school. But we expect and actually maybe not encourage, but almost require students to have an outside mentor within the community. That's part of their academic program, and we ask that students involve themselves as much as possible in other organizations within Brattleboro and the surrounding area, because being connected to an expert and being connected to a mentor and being grounded in community is I think the best way to have people care. But I'm now wondering what our next step is as a school. So if we have those relationships and those connections, but we're not actually teaching the three branches of government in a very explicit way.
How are they going to understand?
Right, exactly.
You brought up a quote which I liked, and I had never heard the Montessori quote about you have to teach a student
to love the world before they can teach them to save it. Right.
So I've been using something not as eloquent. I call it my airplane model. That basically when the mask drops, you have to put it on yourself before you can help the person next to you. I mean, yours is way better, but I do believe that is really part of the problem. Once we have got into focus, what we can do, and there's a few people, and I believe probably everybody in this room is charged in that direction. Mm-hmm. I think that we can help, but it's a power in numbers game.
Yeah.
And the more people like Miles, who's coming up through the system, who has a really strong understanding about what's going on, can spread it to his friends, who can then spread it to their friends and share it with a friend, who they share it with two friends, and they share it with two friends, and before you know it, we have something. But that's going to take a long time.
Yeah, I mean, just again, when we've been talking about the three branches of government as one of these fundamentals. 2015, another number here that we polled in preparation for this, University of Pennsylvania's Annenberg Public Policy Center, asking 1,000 adults questions about how much they know about government. Only 1 in 3 Americans said they could name all three branches of government.
That makes me feel sad.
Yeah, and these are adults, right? And at the same time, 30% of the people polled believes that the government has the ability to interfere and infringe on First Amendment rights, things like religious practices, public protests. So not understanding.
Selling browser history.
Selling browser history. And I'm not saying that, testing and evaluating is necessarily the right way to go in fixing this problem. Although I did note that the NEEP test, the National Assessment of Education Progress tests, and I got this, I don't remember if this is a national number. Yeah, I believe this is a national number, where they gave a government civics exam to 4th graders. 25% scored the proficient level. 8th graders, 23%. This is from 2014. 23% only scored proficient, and that didn't change from 2010. And again, that's not necessarily the sum total of how you say somebody's learning civics, but it is telling you that there are clearly some gaps there that can be filled in.
I was reading an interesting article in the Atlantic, and I literally cut and pasted a paragraph out of it. It says, while surely there are many varied causes for the current American political situation, one among those is the relative ignorance of basic American history, scientific, technological knowledge, and for what some of us refer to as civics among a large selection of our population. Basically, what we've been discussing here for a little less than an hour, summed up in a paragraph.
Yeah, very well said.
Yeah, so I wanted to bring that with the exception of Miles.
Yeah,
of course, and hopefully more and more like Miles, of course.
So when we think about things, and I'm sure this is constantly Ann in your world, and I'm sure on the state level as well, Stephen, where you're looking at performance reevaluation. I'd be interested in hearing that process. Obviously, it always, right, continuous improvement is a word we hear in every industry, including education. You take some of this data, or you take some of your results from your classroom, and what do you do to try and move that forward in at least an incremental way if we can't make a leap from, 40% voting turnout to 80% voting turnout, but certainly there's ways you're already looking at and say, okay, this is how I could do better with my next class.
I think that's a key element of what we do as teachers, and there's a lot of different ways to go about that. It is, I think, like I was going back to the idea of structure, I think it is tricky in the structure that we have, where basically everyone's coming into the public school, everyone's at different levels, and within one class you might have somebody that's working kind of at a high school level, someone who's at an elementary level. So how do we get all those students moving forward at their particular pace? I think this is what the state's trying to do with these personal learning plans, to have students set goals and then work individually on that. But without more adults in the room to work with students, I think it's going to be a tricky conundrum to have that individualized education work well in a public school setting.
Yeah. Stephen, is it something that on a state level, should they be taking more responsibility? Should they be taking more ownership of this?
I think you're raising a good question, and I think probably the public policy issue ought to be raised. What it would mean was probably amending the existing rules, which is a long 6 to 8 month process. But it's a very open public process and would really garner a lot of opinions and thinking statewide. So I think what this discussion has done is maybe open up the issue and that the state board ought to pursue that. But as I said before, understand the complications of it with all the other requirements that we're now asking our students to accomplish.
Yes, indeed. We are just about at the end of the first hour of the Call to Action Forum on Civics. I want to thank all the folks in the audience, Miles, Wendy, and Jessica, who spoke during the hour, and I definitely want to thank our panel here, and Koplinka-Loehr from Brattleboro Middle School, and Stephan Morse, the former chair of the State Board of Education. We are here until 1 o'clock today. We're going to change over the panel here during the news break, and joining us during the second hour of A Call to Action Civics, we will have the Vermont Secretary of State, Jim Condos, and Matt Wright, founder of the indivisible Brattleboro chapter, to transition from this conversation around civics education to civics engagement. Civics in practice here, a lot of the issues that we've been talking about for this first hour and how we're seeing those turn out. I know Secretary Condos has done a lot to increase access to voting. So we'll get to that in the next hour. Stick with us here on WKVT 100.3 FM and AM 1490. Welcome back to A Call to Action Civics on WKVT 100.3 FM and AM 1490. Chris Lenios and Fish moderating this panel, looking at first civics education, and now for the second hour, civics engagement. We are live in the Brooks Memorial Library meeting room until 1 p.m. Come on by. We have coffee, thanks to the folks at the Works on Main Street in Brattleboro. We also want to thank Brattleboro Savings and Loan and Farnham Insulators for sponsoring these Call to Action forums. Joining us for the panel during this hour, we have the Secretary of State here in the state of Vermont, Jim Condos, as well as Matt Wright, who is part of the Indivisible chapter here in Brattleboro, and appreciate you both coming on today.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And I guess, Secretary Condos, if we could start with you, and you were here and present for the first part of this with regards to civics education, and we were starting with a very fundamental tenet of voting and how people who get civics education tend to vote more than people who don't get civics education. When you're seeing voting happening here in the state, kind of just give us the sense of what you're seeing as far as trends in voting.
Well, I think it's difficult, actually, because it varies from year to year. When you have a presidential election year versus a non-presidential election year. For instance, in a presidential election year, we might get somewhere between 68 and 70% voting of the checklist, and in a non-presidential year, last year it was 46%, and or 2 years ago, I should say, and it's usually in the 50s, low 50s. So it varies and it depends, and I think the biggest thing is it depends on how many candidates, what kind of issues. Those are all things that drive voting. I was interested, though, in listening to the early part. One of the things that didn't come up was No Child Left Behind, which came out around 2002. And in 2003 and 4, I was chair of education in the Senate. and we were dealing with No Child Left Behind, and we were ruining the day that No Child Left Behind essentially ignored civics, and we've said that most of the school systems around the country were just going to throw it overboard because it just wasn't required anymore. There was no real focus on it. And we actually tried to set up a civics program to restart it in the education department and in using the State House and the complex, but we were shut down because of money.
Well, that's an interesting dividing line, certainly, when you talk about some of those unfunded mandates, as I remember that being talked about at the time. But I know Fish was talking in that first segment and about our board operator back in the studio, how there was civics and then there wasn't civics well before the 2000s when you were in high school.
Yeah, well before. 1999 at least.
So that was not necessarily solely because of No Child Left Behind that schools stopped teaching civics as a specific part of
I remember in 8th grade, I mean, I graduated high school in 1969. I'm dating myself, but it was a long time ago. But I remember in 8th grade, we had like 12 weeks of civics. We had American history. It was different components that we had to deal with, starting in the 8th grade and working our way up through high school. And then in high school, I graduated from South Burlington High School, and in high school we had our senior year, it was a mandatory class for all kids in the school that wanted to graduate, and it was called Public Issues and World Affairs. And that was the course. And I even participated on we had a UVM professor, Edward Miles, who was a Canadian studies professor, and he used to take a group of UVM students up to Toronto and Ottawa and to learn how the Canadian government operates. And he offered it up, and about 6 of us from the high school went. And we had a wonderful time just learning about Canadian government, and I just think it's really too bad. It really heartens me that there's people out there like Miles who I hope that passion continues to burn, and I hope that you continue to get involved, and I hope I'm out of politics before you're ready to get in.
When you are looking at, voter turnout in a state like Vermont, and yes, granted, obviously it spikes when we have presidential elections versus off-year elections, and I know that this last one, 2016, and then in 2008, were particularly record-setting in terms of voter turnout, but there's been downward trends otherwise. But as a state like Vermont, where we pride ourselves on having this more active participation, right, with the direct democratic approach of town meeting, does that translate into more voting during election times necessarily?
Town meeting is struggling right now across the state, and I think what you're seeing, first of all, you're seeing most of the towns where they have relatively active town meeting are small towns, whereas if you get into the larger towns, and Vermont doesn't have a lot of large towns, let's be honest. But it just seems that people are busy. They work. They don't have time. It's interesting that the schools have town meeting day off, but it's not a state holiday, but it is a state worker holiday or state teacher holiday, and it's. I think there's things that we can do. I know there's a bill in Congress that I think Representative Welch is supporting, which would move the general election day from the first Tuesday of November to the Saturday and Sunday before, and because he had asked my opinion on it, and then I know that people have also, I think Senator Sanders has put in a bill that would change the Tuesday to a national holiday. And I think those things are things that can help. But we've tried it, even at town meeting day, many towns have tried moving it around to Monday night, to Saturday morning, and nothing seems to be generating unless there's an issue that really gets people excited.
Yeah, like pay as you throw, oddly enough, was the last time I really saw the town of Brattleboro really get engaged in the conversation.
Well, and it's interesting. I served 18 years on the South Burlington City Council. I was chair of that council for 8 years, and we had about a $10 million, $12 million operating budget for the city. And we would have 2 people show up for the public hearing that we were going to hold on it. 2 people.
Yeah.
But if we were going to have a public hearing to discuss the leash law, we'd have 150 people show up. Everybody wanted to speak. It'd be pretty evenly divided, 75 for, 75 against, because of a leash law.
Yeah.
But a $10 or $12 million budget didn't seem to faze people.
Here's an interesting thing, and you brought up the going up and studying the Canadian government, and I think actually having a small understanding about how other governments work is important. And I'm just curious, and I'd love to get both you and Matt's opinion on this. Holland held a national election, at which something like almost everybody showed up, like 98.3%, I think was the number. I can't really remember the number of showed up to vote. That's like everybody who's registered.
Belgium, Turkey, and Sweden consistently have over 80% voter turnout in their elections. So certainly it can be done.
Yeah, and don't forget though, those are completely different countries compared to the United States too. I mean, you're pretty much you're a little more focused than how broad and diverse that we are.
No question. I would agree.
But just before we were talking about one of the people in the audience here, we were mentioning that Australia has mandatory voting, so you have to vote, or you get fined. So I think I don't suspect that that's going to happen here. We're certainly not going to get internet voting in the near future. Probably not in my lifetime, at least. I think there's still a tremendous amount of concern about the viability of it, about the integrity of it.
Oh, yeah.
But we do use the internet for different things. For instance, our overseas and military voters, we will, if we have their email address, we will send them their ballot by email as a PDF. They have to print it off, fill it out, and then they have to mail it back to us. Because Vermont law says you have to have a ballot at the end of the day. So we do have other ways of doing it. But we've tried in my 6 years, in my 6 years as secretary and the 8 years when I was chair of the Government Operations Committee, which oversaw the Secretary of State's office and most of the election law, we have been working our way towards reducing burdens on voting and the focus that we have focused on. And we're also using the social media platforms. We're using Facebook and Twitter to get the message out, and trying to tell people, you've got 5 days left before you can vote. But there are other things that we've done that make some of those things go away as well, is we now have same-day voter registration as of this year.
Right. Mm-hmm. Well, and Vermont certainly has always had an activist culture to it, but I think like in the last election cycle, as Miles was alluding to, a lot of people were activated to be more active now. We have Matt here from the Indivisible chapter of Brattleboro. Wondering, Matt, if you decided to get involved in that organizing and activist aspect of things as an addition to voting, or is it something that you find because you're feeling like voting isn't making the differences that you feel it could in the civic process?
No, I think that's right. The group that I started, or to help to organize here in Brattleboro, started on Inauguration Day. Largely with a group of people who were unhappy with the outcome of the presidential election, and were looking for ways to do more than just vote, right? To see their civic engagement as something continuous and ongoing instead of kind of intermittent and kind of almost symbolic.
So not in place of voting?
No, yeah, as voting plus. Right. Like what are all the things I can do as a citizen? Well, I can vote, I just did that. What else can I do? I can call my representative, right? I can have a public rally. I could write a letter to the newspaper. So there's a number of different ways that we can act as citizens other than town meeting day and election day.
Right. It is a nonstop thing. Now, at the beginning of the show, I sort of reminded everybody that we are government by the people, for the people. And I think that these indivisible chapters that are popping up speak directly to getting the citizenry back and engaged in the process. This is not acceptable, the behavior that's going on now, and here's what we can do about it. Now, maybe you agree with the behavior, so then you opt not to join. If you don't agree with the behavior, then you need to engage and do something. And I know that I follow a lot of Matt's emails that come through, and talking about all the good work that they do. Okay, we're going to meet. We're going to do a letter writing thing, and things like that. They have an impact. They do, and this all stems from the Indivisible. That what is it? 40 pages of how to connect with your political leaders.
Yeah, the kickoff was a couple former congressional staffers from D.C. who had worked for Democratic members of Congress, who had watched the really effective lobbying efforts of Tea Party Republicans, and in their mind, it was just Civics 101. It was show up at a town meeting that your member of Congress is attending and ask a question.
We were calling around, and I was making my phone calls. I think it was when Sessions was up, and I talked to Leahy's office. I was like, "Look, I don't want any part of this guy." And the staffer who picked up Leahy's phone went, "Well, I don't know if you saw Senator Leahy had very strong language," and he started to kind of go on just a little bit of a ramble. And I was like, "Okay, are you done? So listen, if he votes that way, I'm not voting for him in the next election period. And I've voted for this man every year since I've been able to vote."
Yeah.
So, but this will be a game changer for me. Not to be that single voter, but understand that I'm paying attention, and my intention, should he go against how I want him to vote, will be not to vote for him in the next cycle. And I think things like that speak large. And maybe, Secretary Condos, maybe you can tell me. I mean, does like one voter saying that, does that have an impact? I mean, is there a metric behind that?
One voter probably would not. If you're one voter out of several hundred that have called today, then you probably are making an impact. And I think the other piece of this has to be, and as I said, I served as a city councilor, I served as a state senator, civility, and I can't speak to that enough points. Because I remember we had this one individual that used to email the entire Senate, all 30 members of the Senate, and he would email completely in caps, yelling at you about how, and then use words like how stupid you are, this is idiotic, and going through. And my colleagues in the Senate used to hate me because I used to respond to the guy. And I would start out by saying, "Thank you so much for your email."
Yeah, kill him with kindness.
Yeah, kill him with kindness.
And then I said, I don't think we will ever agree on this topic, but let me explain to you how I voted or why I voted the way I did.
Right.
And this guy used to write back to me, and he'd say, "Condos, I don't necessarily agree with you, but I respect you because at least you responded to me." And the rest of my colleagues would get mad at me for responding to this guy. They said, "Just ignore him." And I think that's part of the problem, is we ignore those that we don't want to listen to.
Right.
And that's, I think, where politicians have gotten a bad name. And I really do mean that sincerely. That you have to listen to people. You're going to disagree. I always tell people that are getting into politics, if you're going to get into politics, understand one thing up front: you can never please everybody all the time.
Well, and when we're talking about the work that a group like Indivisible is doing, or other grassroots organizations, and here in Vermont, there is very much a situation of kind of preaching to the choir. When you're appealing to a Bernie Sanders or a Patrick Leahy or a Peter Welch, very often they're going to vote the way you're telling them to vote. But that must be part of the conversation if you're talking about trying to speak to, say, Governor Phil Scott about an issue that is on the other side, or vice versa, somebody who might be part of an organization that's more conservative-minded wanting to speak to one of these Democratic politicians. Talk a little about in the group there, Matt, how you counsel people to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the story that you just told there, Secretary, is just as valid from the side of the person making the phone call, right? I'm thinking there was a point a few weeks ago where Donald Trump had invited a bunch of Republican governors to comment on ACA, repeal and replace. Like, we have a Republican governor. I wonder what his comment was.
Right.
So, we call the office, but it doesn't do anyone in America service for me to be hostile on the telephone or for any of our members. And plus, it feels terrible, right?
Yeah.
How often can you pick up the phone angry? I don't want to be angry for 4 years. So I was also going to say there's a flip side to this low participation, low voter turnout status quo, which is that I've heard from both Leahy's office and Welch's office that if they get 300 phone calls on an issue, it pushes it to the top of their agenda.
Yeah.
That's not a whole lot of phone calls, right?
But is that like a threshold? Like they said, 300 is like a number?
Roughly,
or
like
just
that's the number that they talked about. Like if we get 300 phone
Right.
calls, that would get us to the top of our agenda. Or Phil Scott, when the Muslim ban was first put in place and folks are in the airports, offering free legal assistance, and Governor Scott made a really great statement about how Trump's executive action didn't stand for the values of Vermonters, didn't take care of Vermonters or Americans. And my organization and other groups called to thank him for that statement. Afterwards, he was interviewed about that. He said, well, you're a Republican. I know you got phone calls on both sides. He's like, yeah, it was a big deal. I got 1,500 phone calls. Again, that's not a big number. If not a lot of people are participating, then your voice does count a lot, right? If only 1,500 phone calls were made and you and 10 of your friends called, that's a big chunk of the whole public voice that you got to participate in.
We have a metric that we use in radio. If one person feels impassioned enough to call the radio station because they didn't like something somebody said, then there probably are about 5 or 6 people behind them who haven't called. And the same can be true when you're making a phone call into Leahy, Sanders, or Welch's, that for every one person that calls, there's probably a bigger number of people that agree with you that aren't calling. So when I get somebody who says to me, but yeah, I mean, whatever. So, my phone call's not going to make a difference. Well, no, it does. And here's how. One person calls in, your cousin calls in to complain about the same thing that you've been talking about, you both agree on. Your cousin calls, and now you're going to let him be your voice. So if that metric is true, and there are 10 people behind that one phone call, so if you call, all of a sudden that 10 turns into 20. And that's how the metric goes out. And I believe that there is a metric that is used on a level.
Well, and you highlighted the point that I also wanted to touch on, which is people are constantly retelling us, well, one vote isn't going to make a difference.
Yeah.
One vote isn't going to make a difference. I always, during the campaign, I would always say to people, do you know that Senator Sanders, when he first got elected mayor, won by 10 votes?
That's a really good point.
Over a Republican and a Democrat, and it was an incumbent Democrat. So he won by 10 votes that first time around, and we have had over the last 6 years many recounts. There was one not too far up the road here that was one vote difference, and then it flipped. This year it flipped, and the losing person on election day ended up winning by one vote. So one vote does make a difference. We've got several House rep seats that were won by 5 votes, 7 votes. So this thing that people think, I always, in fact, on the back of my truck, I have a sticker that says, "Your vote is your voice."
Right.
Yeah.
And that's the key.
Secretary Condos, what about that other point I thought Matt made about affirmation, calling and thanking somebody for their vote? I mean, that probably doesn't happen enough, but does that, I could see that carrying over for a lawmaker because these issues come up again and again and again, maybe not exactly the same way, but certainly in different permutations.
Yes. Thank you calls are wonderful. And I can tell you, I am someone who comes from, a working class family. I grew up in the Burlington area. My father was in the restaurant business. My mother was a secretary at the college at the University of Vermont, and my entire life working has always been about customer service. And today, when I first walked into the office, I said, we're going to be different from most other agencies. We're going to answer the phone. We're not going to let it go to voicemail. We're going, unless there's a good reason, you're going to answer that. You're going to respond to that person within 24 hours. And the thing that I most appreciate is when I get a phone call to thank me for that. And I will very often, when I get that, it's about, usually they'll tell me who it was, and I will send an email right to that person and their supervisor, thanking them so much for the excellent customer service they provided. There's nothing better for people than a thank you.
Well, I think this American Health Care Act and the replacement of the Affordable Care Act was indicative of that. It took almost taking away this health care law for people to actually come out and say, it's working for me, right? That's what we saw. I mean, I've said many times on the air, on my show leading in, is like at some point somebody needs to come forward and talk about how this law is working for them to counteract this narrative that, because you couldn't say Obamacare without putting the word disastrous or another adjective in front of it if you were in opposition to it, and not enough people were coming out and saying, yes, this is working for me or working for us. I mean, it seems like Indivisible kind of came along just in the nick of time, Matt, in some ways. I mean, that was really the driving issue for a lot of people, was the health care issue, I imagine.
Yeah, or immigration, or the Muslim ban, or the wall. We've been able to call sympathetic offices like Welch or Sanders or Leahy and say, like, hey, what else can we do? Thank you for that, your opposition. What else can we do? What else would work? And sometimes they're like, keep paying attention, right? Yeah. Don't get tired. Right, that was a good piece of advice. They said, hey, make sure that there are people running for all the offices in your town. I mean, if you think voter turnout's low, we have many offices in Brattleboro where people are just running unopposed because it's essentially they're just volunteer positions. Right? Because no one has the time or energy or motivation to fill these roles on a select board or a school board. And that was a good piece of advice. Mm-hmm. Or get on the radio or write a letter to the editor, participate in the broader conversation.
There's a lot you can do.
So even those positive phone calls can be fruitful, I think.
Yeah, delivering those messages to the places where people are receiving those messages is definitely the best way to go. Matt Wright, one of the members of the Indivisible chapter here in Brattleboro, Jim Condos, Secretary of State, our guests. We're going to pause for a short break here. We also have somebody in the audience who is part of another grassroots organization doing a lot of great work statewide in Vermont as well as across the border in New Hampshire. We'll hear from her as well when we come back to A Call to Action Civics live from the Brooks Memorial Library up until 1 o'clock today on WKVT 100.3 FM and 1490 AM. Welcome back to A Call to Action Civics on WKVT. Chris Lenios and Fish broadcasting live from the Brooks Memorial Library meeting room on the top floor of the Brooks Memorial Library. Once again, want to thank Brattleboro Savings and Loan and Farnham Insulators for their sponsorship of this, and want to thank everybody who has joined us today here, both the panel members, and right now we have Vermont Secretary of State Jim Condos, as well as Matt Wright, who is part of the Indivisible chapter here in Brattleboro. We have some guests in the audience as well, but Fish, you wanted to make a point about the Electoral College.
I did, and it was curious because we always talk about my vote doesn't matter, and I was just curious, and I have a feeling I know what both of you are going to say, but I could be surprised. About the Electoral College, and I know that that's more of a national thing. Do we need to get rid of it and just go by popular vote, or is there really some merit to the Electoral College? Start with you, Secretary Condos.
It would take a constitutional amendment, first of all. Which
I'm okay with
that.
Difficult. We got people.
So that's first thing on. But I've been a supporter of national popular vote, which we finally passed in 2000. I think it was 11. I was out of the Senate by then, and then Secretary of State. But in 2005 or 6, somewhere around there, I first introduced it. Chris Pearson, representative from Burlington, introduced it on the House side. And it took a while. And essentially what national popular vote does is you sign a compact, a consortium, that you are part of this group of states, that if we get to the 270 votes that are needed, that once we get that many electoral votes locked in, that it will then basically kick in that national popular vote will win. And so that is, I think right now it's probably less than 20 states, and it's about 170 votes. So we're still a ways away, but it's every year a couple more states get added.
And do you need, 35 or 36 states to amend it? Is that
the Constitution?
Yeah.
I think it's 3/4.
Yeah. All right.
It's kind of serving as remedial civics education for a lot of us who are getting involved. So last week, we were learning what the word cloture meant, because it has, it's a move in the Senate that has to do with this Gorsuch nomination.
Yeah.
And just this Monday, I kind of forwarded on an educational piece about just how does tax and spending decisions work their way through Congress. Because it's kind of an arcane system, right?
Yeah.
And there's a budget fight coming up that we would like to participate in, and we're going to be knuckleheads if we don't understand anything about the way that works.
Right.
So questions like this, I think, are, for those of us who are newly activated, between election days to participate, it's kind of a spur for us to do some of this remedial education, understand more of the arcana of how the system works.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Indivisible, one of the many organizations doing a lot of work around activism in the state of Vermont. In the audience here, we have Brenda Siegel. Now, a lot of people know Brenda. I'll give a plug to Southern Vermont Dance Festival, but somebody who's certainly been active in the political scene here, even before getting involved with another organization recently called Rights and Democracy.
Yeah. So I should just say that before I grew up in a family that was very active, not necessarily as much, although some on my father's side, but on my mother's side, it's a very activist family all around. Everybody is extremely involved. And I grew up with the idea that you have to be. Because of that, they lived more in Vermont, and I spent more time with that side of my family. And just that's the right thing to do. And when you see injustice, you speak out, period. So definitely I had the benefit of having that upbringing. But even then, you get involved in your own life, and you don't, I'm a single mom, so you get really involved, and you have excuse after excuse for why you aren't going to be as involved as you should or could be. And so actually during the primary, I was very involved in the Bernie Sanders campaign in 3 different states, and was actually kind of appalled at the way the system works, and in some states how differently it works. And I decided then that I would be involved. And then I campaigned for Hillary Clinton during the general election, and in fact in New Hampshire on election day. And I came back on November 9th and walked into my dad's house and said, there's nothing that's going to stop me from being an activist, no matter what the consequence of my activism is. I will not allow this to be the reality.
That's good to hear.
Yeah, I mean, obviously you were unfortunately on the losing side of those campaigns.
Right.
But it actually made you more resolute, it sounds
right,
like.
and I was on college campuses on election day. So what I saw on college campuses was young people feeling very disenfranchised by the primary process, really feeling not heard, really feeling like they were told over and over and over and over and over again that they just don't understand how it works, and that you have to be more practical and blah. And so we weren't hearing them. And so I came into it really feeling like if we don't hear these people under 30, then we're never going to get back to where we're winning. And by winning, I mean making progress. I don't mean winning in the game part of politics, because I don't think that's what's important to me, but winning in terms of making progress, especially social progress, which I feel like as human beings, that's really what we should be about. We aren't a business. We are human beings. And how important it is to make things that we want to be happening national, like the $15 an hour minimum wage, happen locally, because it's really states that change those policies in the long run. And so I actually somewhat shifted so that we have a multiple focus of local action, national action, and some support of groups that are maybe being marginalized.
And are those actions now, are they phone calls, letters?
Well, I put out a weekly action report.
Okay.
And the weekly action is each day there's 1 to 4 actions. Usually they're short actions, sometimes they're longer. And they are a mix of local and national. Some are phone calls, some are showing up at a rally. So it's a really big mixture. And then I also put that on the Weekend Network, and I also we'll put that on my whole group, which is a total of about 100 people that have come back and forth and being involved with us. And I continued to go to the RAD meetings because I wanted to actually have information about the local stuff. And then I found myself quickly swept in to being much more involved with RAD, because I really like what they're doing, how they approach it, and how they empower individuals to become part of the local system. And they're really great at finding where your passion is and helping you to act from there. And they're both in New Hampshire and Vermont, and they're grassroots, and they are looking to work on social justice, economic justice, and environmental justice issues. And they have several different initiatives going on, one of them being the $15 an hour minimum wage, paid family and medical leave. And I know I'm leaving out many of them, so I'm just going to go over here.
Well, I know their agenda is comprehensive, and I also know that a lot of people might have first heard of them last year when they did a rally here, bringing Senator Sanders along with the Democratic candidate for governor, Sue Minter, and some other people here into the community. It sounds to me like their focus has shifted to policy, much like Indivisible, that you're focused on issues rather than candidates.
I think they're going to do both, is what I understand, is that there is that in the first year they had actually a big impact on policy as well, with winning paid sick days and automatic voter registration and election day voter registration, which I believe Jim Condos was a huge part of, which they are thanking you very much for that.
There's your thank you call.
Yeah. I am supposed to thank you on behalf of RAD. And so policy's always been part of it, but they've also, in addition, I believe that they've endorsed more than 40 candidates, and they will continue to do that. So I think that that's going to be a dual, it's always going to be both. Mm-hmm. So, but in between policy is what you're working on. I think that's a little what you were saying, Matt, is that you can't just vote. We have to also do the other stuff.
Right. There's these two political parties, and I know that Indivisible and RAD are working now to get Faisal Gill to come to Wilmington. Like, who is this guy? He is the interim chairman of the state Democratic Party.
Yeah, he's actually, I think, the permanent one now. I think he was recently elected.
No, he's
still interim?
Interim until November. Okay. So, state Democratic Party chairman, interim election, not on my radar screen 2 years ago. No idea about how that worked. Very interested in how that worked right now, right?
Yeah.
Because the way the primaries played out for Sanders and Hillary was not cool. And we didn't get the strongest candidate on the national stage. And it's not really clear what a Democratic Party is doing to prepare for a gubernatorial election in 2018. So I think that...
Slowly. Well,
so I think that that even the Democratic Party is getting attention from these like left-wing activist groups.
So we've got about 10 minutes left in the hour. We do have to squeeze in one quick break while we do that. So we'll take a break, and then we'll begin to kind of assemble this into something we can gift wrap and take home.
Yeah.
All right.
We'll fix the problem.
We'll fix the problem right here. All right.
Call to action, Civics from Brooks Memorial Library. Stick with us here. We'll be back right after these messages. And we are back at Brooks Memorial Library, wrapping up a call to action Civics. Chris Lenios and Fish moderating. Second hour of the panel with Secretary of State Jim Condos, as well as Matt Wright of Brattleboro Indivisible, Brenda Siegel of Rights and Democracy, as well as a number of other organizations, Huddle, as she mentioned before. And I wanted to pick up on this activism point that we were talking about right before the break to ask both Matt and Brenda a question, and Secretary, you might want to weigh in on this as well. But certainly the other arrow in the quiver, so to speak, is civil disobedience. I mean, there's a certain faction of activism here where you start to not see what the result that you want. You conduct civil disobedience, hopefully civil disobedience, but arrests, things like that. Is that in the conversation for organizations like Rights and Democracy, for organizations like Indivisible? Right now you're working within the constructs. You're trying to enact change within the party system or within the voting system. But at some point, is that something that is in the conversation for organizations like you, or the two of you individually, as far as when you don't see the things that you want result-wise, but you feel are right? And I don't know, Matt, why don't you start us off with that question?
Okay. I would say that most of the people I know who are in part of this newly engaged progressive activist community aren't looking to get all of their satisfaction from one individual strategy, right? And so my organization, Indivisible, we have a playbook, right? And we can do what we can do well. There are other organizations that have a great track record in doing public civil disobedience stuff that stays civil, where property is protected and people behave themselves and a public statement can get made. And we just don't have that skill set. It would be sloppy or small if we tried to organize that. And that's fine because other people are really great at that. And I think that it's good for people to know what they can do well and what they're comfortable doing and what they really feel feeds them. For me personally, I have found that exhausts me and leaves me unmotivated afterwards. Right? I went to the climate march and I did nothing for a year after that because it was hard to get my whole family down to New York and stay overnight and wait for an hour before we were allowed to start marching. And, I didn't feel like that was something that fed me personally. But I know that other people have come back from the Women's March incredibly fired up and motivated. So I think it's a matter of finding the kind of work. It's just like a lot of things. Find the kind of work that you do well, where you make a contribution, and then lean into that and trust that other people are also doing their jobs well.
Right.
Brenda.
So, speaking for Rights and Democracy, I know that one of their members, or maybe it's one of the people that's an organizer, was arrested actually in D.C. last on Thursday during a healthcare action where there were 24 people. I believe in front of the White House, and they were standing there to represent the 24 million people that would lose their health care if the what I call the Americans Lose Their Health Care Act was passed, and it was sent around in an email like this great thing happened. So yes, I would say that is part of it for people who are comfortable that way. And I would say that for myself as well. Right now, that's not how and I would think carefully about that kind of action because I am the only parent of my child. But there are situations I would stand in the line of fire before I would watch a Muslim person get hurt, and I would link arms with people to keep people from being deported that I don't think should be deported. So there are situations in which I believe that my own safety or well-being or arrest status is something that I would put aside for the greater good.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, and it is hard. Those decisions are hard. I keep saying that voting locally is how you do it, and it just like putting air into a balloon. You have to start with one breath, and maybe that's in your local election. Then you blow again, and it's your state level, and then you go out. And this is something that's going to be fought from the outside in. And if you could put D.C. in the center of the U.S. and just surround it and just come in from that angle, things will change. But it's going to take people that are listening at home, people who are sitting in this room, people who have talked on the microphone to do that. That's what folks like Matt's organization with Indivisible are doing. State help from folks like Secretary Condos. But Secretary Condos, anything, we've got about 3 minutes left. Is there anything that you'd like to put out there?
Well, my office will continue to remove barriers from voting. We believe that voting is the very core, the very basis of our democracy, and it is so important. We've talked about the popular vote. It happened in 2000. It happened again this past year, where the person with the most votes didn't win. But there's also what happened in 2004, which doesn't get talked about a lot, and that is if Ohio had flipped 60,000 votes, had gone for John Kerry would have won the presidency based on Electoral College, even though he would have lost the popular vote by 3 million votes. So it works both ways, and you have to be careful what you're asking for. But we continue to take the barriers out. In 2010, we passed a constitutional amendment here in Vermont that allows 17-year-olds to register and vote in the primaries if they will be 18 by the day of the election, the general election. We've added same-day voter registration. We've added automatic voter registration. Both of those started January 1st of this year. We have what's called the My Voter page. Once you are registered in Vermont, you have your own unique page. You put in your there's some criteria you put in, and it only knows you. And once you get that, you actually get to your voter page, which will give you your address, so your current address that they have listed. It'll tell you who your town clerk is, what her hours are, how to reach her. It lets you request an absentee ballot over the via the internet. So there's a lot of things that we were one of the first states in the country to put that My Voter page out there. So we're really pleased about the actions that we're taking. But it still comes down to people have got to get out and vote.
Absolutely. And once again, proving the point that I've always said, Vermont is a much stronger state than people give it credit for. We often lead the way in things that are inherently right, and what you just laid out is inherently right.
Yeah. I want to thank folks in the audience like Brenda Siegel, who joined us today during the Call to Action Forum. I want to thank our panelists, including right now Vermont Secretary of State Jim Condos and Matt Wright of Brattleboro Indivisible, as well as Ann Koplinka-Loehr of Brattleboro Middle School, and Stephan Morse for all joining us today here on the panel. It's really been a pleasure. I want to thank the co-moderator Fish here, as well as Linda Steele doing the board operator in Brattleboro Middle School. We now return to our regularly scheduled programming on WKVT.